It was the 10th time Mr. Harper had noticed Carl slacking off work, and today was the last straw. He had seen the reports and how he was severely underperforming compared to his other colleagues. As Mr. Harper fired Carl, he wouldn't let him get a word in, not even allowing him to explain himself. Maybe Mr. Harper should have let him, but he had been done with Carl's antics. It made Carl's final mutterings even more ominous as he said, "You'll regret this decision before leaving." Carl had said before storming off, leaving Mr. Jonathan Harper standing in his office. He had a small smile on his face as firing Carl had gone off without a hitch. Probably just an empty threat, Jonathan muttered to himself, shrugging off Carl's words. He had no clue how wrong he actually was about that. Jonathan truly believed firing Carl had been the best course of action. The guy had been underperforming for quite a while, and Jonathan could finally make a schedule with competent people to improve production as soon as next week. That was until he felt something heavy settle in his gut. He knew what Carl was up to. Jonathan cursed to himself. Though he had seen Carl leave his office, Carl could be wreaking all sorts of havoc at this right moment. He immediately sprang into action, quickly rushing out of his office and following the way Carl had gone. He could be doing many things, and Jonathan had to be the one to stop him. However, where could he have gone? This wasn't just a factory with one exit or a singular door. No, this was a labyrinth of passageways and corridors, and maybe he didn't have enough time to go through them all before it was too late. He had to think of something quick. Just as he wanted to yell out in frustration, he'd got it. He knew exactly where to go. Jonathan knew he had to move fast. He turned around and dashed toward his destination. "Sorry, pardon me," he said as he moved past his other employees, or if he had to weave through a group of them. They were looking at him with a confused look in their eyes, but they were never the ones to question their boss. He certainly wouldn't let it deter him, especially with his goal in sight. He pushed open the door, bursting inside, as the two men sitting inside turned around, looking startled at the sudden noise. Upon seeing the boss, Mr. Harper, they both let out a breath. "You scared the bejesus out of me, boss. Is everything all right?" Leroy asked. Yes, everything is all right. I just need to see some footage," Jonathan said, walking inside the security camera room. Multiple TVs were around this room, each depicting at least one square of continuous footage of things happening inside Mr. Harper's factory. Whatever Carl had done must be visible on one of these cameras. "Leroy, Thomas, you can both have your breaks. I have to check something alone," Jonathan instructed. The two security guards look at each other confusedly but nod and leave the room, not passing up on an extra break as they had taken theirs before now. Jonathan immediately goes to the time Carl had been in his office and hits play. He sees Carl enter his office and after some speeding up, sees him open it with a slam as he emerges angrily from Jonathan's office. Now he could slow down and fast forward the footage until he saw the fluent stream of how Carl walked and what he did while he was leaving. All the evidence was right there. He only had to spot whatever he did that would make Jonathan regret his decision. "Jonathan, what are you doing?" he asks himself as no one else is in the room. He tries to find if Carl had pushed any buttons, unscrewed anything, or meddled with something. But Carl had just been walking in a straight line. He had gotten his stuff from his locker and walked off. The action makes Jonathan frown but sag with relief. It had only just been an empty threat, or at least that is what Jonathan now thought. Jonathan couldn't shake off the unease. Digging deeper into the footage, he looks for clues in Carl's behavior before their final talk. Yet everything seemed normal. Carl was just doing his job, no signs of sabotage or malice. Frustration brewed inside Jonathan. How could he have misjudged the situation so badly? But the words "you'll regret this" echoed in his mind, amplifying his doubt. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as Jonathan waited for his security team, alone with his thoughts. He replayed Carl's departure, searching it for missed details. Yet, without solid evidence, Carl's ominous warning felt more like a ghost haunting him. The uncertainty was maddening. Was Carl's threat just a bluff? He was so in thought that the door opening startled him. Luckily, it was just Louis and Thomas returning from the small break Jonathan had given them. Back in his office, Jonathan tries to refocus on his work, but Carl's words worm their way through his thoughts, persistent and unsettling. Jonathan's intuition screamed that he was overlooking something crucial. With a heavy heart, he decides it was time to leave no stone unturned, to look where he hadn't yet. Jonathan takes a detour, walking past the machinery Carl had often handled. His eyes scan each device, searching for anything amiss. Yet everything was as it should be. No signs of tampering, no sabotage. The factory hummed with the usual rhythm of productivity. Was he just chasing shadows, driven by paranoia of Carl's unsettling words? Faced with normality at every turn, Jonathan's resolve wavered. Had Carl's parting words been nothing more than a spiteful attempt to unsettle him? It seemed increasingly likely. Yet the nagging doubt lingered, a stubborn cloud over his thoughts. Perhaps, Jonathan considered, the true sabotage was the seed of fear Carl had planted in his mind, which had already begun to sprout. Jonathan approaches his employees, seeking any shred of insight into Carl's behavior. Anything odd about Carl? He casually asked those who worked closely with him. Their responses varied, but nothing substantial came up until Bryce mentioned Carl's frequent unaccounted absences, always off somewhere, he says with a shrug, as if inconsequential. However, Jonathan didn't see it that way. Bryce's words stuck with Jonathan as he mulled over Carl's mysterious disappearances. If Carl was often missing, what was he actually doing? Yet before Jonathan could spiral, another worker chimed in, joking about Carl's legendary PE. Jonathan couldn't help but crack a small smile, pondering the casual dismissal. Jonathan wanted to believe there was nothing more to it, convincing himself Kyle's behavior was part of his lackluster work ethic. Back in the security room alone, Jonathan replayed the footage, focusing on the times Bryce mentioned. True enough, Carl disappeared regularly, but Jonathan found himself agreeing with the theory of lengthy bathroom breaks. It seemed to align with Carl's overall lackadaisical attitude towards work. This reaffirmed Jonathan's decision to fire Carl, believing it was Carl's lack of seriousness about his job that led to his dismissal. As Jonathan interacted with more employees, their unanimous lack of concern over Carl's behavior comforted him. The factory buzzed with productivity, and any lingering ease about Carl's warning began to fade. Jonathan allowed himself a moment of relief as he returned to his office. The doubts that had once clouded his mind were now being silenced by his team's collective dismissiveness. Jonathan settled back into the rhythm of his responsibilities, the ordeal with Carl moving to the back of his mind. He focused on the here and now, the factory's operations running smoothly under his watch. However, unbeknownst to him, he overlooked a crucial detail in Carl's pattern of behavior. Carl's parting words, once thought to be an empty threat, bore a weighty truth that Jonathan had yet to uncover. 2 days had flown by in a blur of work when a knock on his office door broke Jonathan's concentration. "Jonathan, come in!" he called out, not looking up from his papers. The door opened to reveal Jared, a quiet guy who worked closely with Carl, but had a few days off when everything happened. Jared looked almost nervous to be there, which made Jonathan curious about what he might want to ask. Jared hesitated before speaking up. "Jared, sir, I noticed Carl hasn't been around. I checked his locker and it's still full. What's going on?" Jonathan paused, realizing he hadn't yet announced Carl's firing to the team. The locker detail nagged at him, but he brushed it aside momentarily, focusing on Jared's confused expression, searching for the right words to explain the situation. Jonathan cleared his throat, masking his discomfort with a managerial tone. "Jonathan, Carl's no longer with us. We had to make some cuts, and unfortunately, Carl didn't meet the deadlines I set for the team. It was a tough decision," he explained, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Jared nodded slowly, a shadow of disappointment crossing his features. Jared's response was measured, betraying a mix of emotions. "Jared, I see. If it's about keeping the company on track, I understand." He paused as if wanting to say more, but instead just nodded again and left Jonathan alone with his thoughts. The conversation left Jonathan feeling uneasy, Jared's acceptance doing little to quell the growing sense of dread in the pit of his stomach. Alone again, Jonathan couldn't shake off the mention of Carl's locker still filled with his belongings. Why hadn't Carl come to clear it out? What if Carl's warning was about something hidden? There, a cold wave of dread washed over him, the weight of Carl's parting words suddenly heavy in the air. The possibility of overlooking something dangerous, something critical, filled him with an urgent need to act. Jonathan couldn't sit still, his thoughts racing about what could be in Carl's locker. Without wasting another second, he stood up, his resolve hardening. He had to make a beeline for the locker room. The idea of finding something dangerous hidden among Carl's things made his heart beat faster. He had to know, had to be sure. Jonathan decided he needed backup before confronting whatever might be waiting in Carl's locker. He quickly went to the security room where he found Thomas. "Jonathan, I need your help with something," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. The gravity of the situation was clear, and having Thomas by his side gave Jonathan a slight sense of reassurance. As they walked toward the locker room, Thomas's curiosity piqued. "Thomas, what's going on?" Jonathan kept it brief, explaining his concerns about Carl's locker without diving too deep into his own anxieties. He mentioned Carl's unsettling parting words, and the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. Thomas listened intently, his expression turning serious as he processed the information. "Thomas, should we call the police if you think it's something dangerous?" Jonathan hesitated, but ultimately shook his head. "Jonathan, I might just be overthinking things. Let's see what we find first." Despite the unease twisting in his gut, he wasn't ready to escalate the situation without knowing more. Jonathan hoped he was just being paranoid. Reaching the locker room, Jonathan and Thomas found it buzzing with activity. They exchanged looks, silently agreeing to wait until the room emptied. Standing by the door, Thomas's nervousness was palpable, mirroring Jonathan's own tension. As the last worker left, the room fell silent, leaving them alone with the looming mystery of Carl's locker. The moment of truth was upon them, and Jonathan's hand trembled as he reached for the key. With the locker number etched firmly in his mind, Jonathan led Thomas through the rows of metal doors until they stood before Carl's. He handed the key over, his own hands slightly shaking from the mix of anticipation and dread. Thomas took the key, his grip firm yet hesitant, as if understanding the weight of the moment. They were on the brink of uncovering whatever secret Carl had left behind. Thomas hesitated at the locker, his uncertainty mirroring Jonathan's earlier apprehensions. But spurred by Jonathan's assurance that it was probably nothing to worry about, he turned the key. The click of the lock seemed to echo louder than expected, marking the end of their wait. The door swung open, revealing the contents that had been the source of so much speculation. The locker was a time capsule of Carl's time at the factory, filled with personal items and work stuff. Jonathan mentally noted the need to clear it out soon, but was snapped back to reality by Thomas's sharp intake of breath. His heart skipped a beat, expecting the worst, only to find Thomas staring wide-eyed at something inside. "Jonathan, what? What is it?" Jonathan asked, peering inside but finding nothing out of the ordinary at first glance. His eyes scanned the locker's contents, trying to spot anything that could have elicited such a reaction from Thomas. His concern grew with each passing second, imagining all sorts of ominous possibilities. "Thomas, it's my watch. I lost this a month ago and never thought I'd see it again," Thomas exclaimed, his voice a mixture of surprise and relief. Jonathan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his initial fears dissolving. The tension that had built up slowly unwound, leaving a sense of anticlimax but also relief. Carl's locker, it seemed, held no dark secrets after all, just a lost and found item of little consequence. Consequence to anyone but Thomas. Jonathan told Thomas he'd make sure to write down where they happened to find the watch if Carl can't explain. It might be considered the he said. Thomas seemed okay with that response. It was a small step, but it helped make things a bit clearer after all the weirdness with Carl and his locker. They both looked through Carl's locker together, finding some pretty strange things. Some items seemed to belong to someone other than someone who worked there. It was weird to see stuff that didn't fit with what they knew about Carl. It made them both raise their eyebrows. However, it didn't exactly scream danger to them. Among Carl's things, Jonathan found bottles of stuff he didn't know much about. If he had to guess, he would guess it to be some sort of chemical. The labels had big, complicated words and complex names, and he had no clue what they were for. He handled them carefully, not knowing their purpose, but aside from being most likely used for cleaning, they didn't seem dangerous. After looking through everything, Jonathan and Thomas decided there wasn't anything scary or dangerous in Carl's locker. They put everything back and locked it up again. It felt like they were ending a big search, even though they still had many questions. For now, whatever Carl was warning about wasn't as a big deal as he made it out to be. Jonathan thanked Thomas for helping him out as they both walked off. After Thomas left, Jonathan headed back to his office, thinking over everything that had happened. He felt better, like there wasn't anything to worry about after all. However, what he didn't know was that he had missed something really important, and that it would surely bite him in the future. Back in his office, Jonathan picked up his phone and dialed Carl's number, hoping for answers, but all he got was voicemail. He listened to the beep, feeling the irritation bubble up inside him. It was just like Carl to not pick up when things got tough. Jonathan hung up, his fingers tapping on the desk in frustration. Not one to give up easily, Jonathan tried calling Carl again, but just like the first time, it went straight to voicemail. He could feel his patience wearing thin as he listened to the same recorded message. He put his phone down with a huff, deciding on a different approach. An email would have to do. Jonathan typed out his email with a stern expression. He told Carl about the locker search and the watch he had found and gave him a clear ultimatum. Empty the locker by the end of the week, or everything gets tossed and the police will be called. He felt a bit smug imagining Carl's reaction to being cornered like this. It felt good to take back some control. But Carl's reply came quicker than expected. "I'm out of town for 10 days. If I were you, I wouldn't throw away the contents of the locker," it read. Jonathan's smugness vanished, replaced by a flare of anger. How dare Carl dictate terms from afar? Jonathan wanted to throw everything out just to spite him, but hesitated, remembering Carl's warning words. Jonathan's hands itched to just get rid of Carl's stuff and maybe even call the cops on him out of spite. But as he sat there fuming, that gnawing feeling in his stomach and Carl's ominous words kept him from acting on his anger. Despite everything, he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, Carl's warning was something he should take seriously. A whole week slipped by, and Jonathan hadn't touched Carl's locker or called the cops. Then trouble hit like a lightning bolt. Employees started complaining about the machines acting up. Jonathan listened, his stomach sinking. It wasn't any machine causing trouble. It was the one Carl used to operate. Deep down, Jonathan wasn't all that surprised. Determined, Jonathan headed straight to the problematic machine. Every step felt